Hello, you're listening to Liberty Rants. Today I want to talk about a topic that has affected the world, COVID-19. The response to this virus has been a very contentious topic between what I call the maskers and the anti-maskers, or grandma killers, a term I'm beginning to embrace, I might add. And there's no question that this topic has been highly politicized. Now, I've both witnessed and been involved in various arguments with individuals over the topic of the lockdown, masks, death counts, you name it. Most of the time, the maskers seem to think these dumb right-wingers are just selfish. They want to kill everyone's grandma. But I'm here to explain the anti-maskers' thoughts and positions, as well as question your own. Under this video, I will have links to my sources backing my claims, just to prove that even a dumb, flyover state freedom-loving man can do some research. First, let's run through a quick history dealing with this virus. The first confirmed case in the US was on January 20th, 2020, but the first known case stemmed from Wuhan, China, back in November 2019. Of course, it was very possible that the COVID virus was in the US much earlier than we expected, because there were over 380,000 passengers that flew from China to the US in the month of January alone. After the discovery of the spread of this virus into numerous countries and the US, panic ensued throughout the world. This, of course, spurred the so-called government experts to provide advice on containing the new dangerous virus. And I'm not debating whether or not the virus is dangerous. It certainly is to specific groups of the population. The news media in the US most notably talked about Italy, as they had tremendous difficulty treating patients. They also talked about the Ferguson model and the 2.2 million deaths the US could expect if they didn't lock down. Then on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared the new virus a global pandemic. 5 days later, our overlords told us we had to lock down the economy for 15 days to flatten the curve. Upon the advice from our federal overlords, states began issuing emergency orders. Only those businesses deemed essential must remain. Such as Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot. Not those small businesses that provided similar or the same services. And we were told we were doing this just to make room for hospital patients, because the hospitals would be overrun. Of course, the restrictions continue to this day in many states, nearly 6 months or 180 plus days after the initial restrictions. And of course, these experts presented the lockdowns as if there would be no supplementary consequences to human lives. However, there's now evidence to suggest that 60% of small businesses will be permanently closed. And even worse, emergency stroke evaluations are down 40%. And of the 650,000 cancer patients receiving chemotherapy in the United States, an estimated of half are missing their treatments. That's 325,000 cancer patients missing treatments that could potentially save their lives. Of the 150,000 cancer cases typically discovered each month in the US, most are no longer being diagnosed, and about 2/3 to 3/4 of the routine cancer screenings are not even happening because of shutdown policies and fear among the population. On top of that, there are nearly 85% fewer living donor transplants occurring now compared to the same time last year. In addition, UNICEF warned early on that indiscriminate lockdowns could increase child mortality by 45% due to the lack of supplies to treat other diseases in those countries already struggling financially. A model used to determine these deaths predicted up to 1.2 million child deaths. And of course, the doubtful of these overlords are the grandma killers. But apparently we're not the only ones with blood on our hands. Continuing on with history. Over the course of the time of the virus was spreading through our country, various advice on mask wearing was also provided by our experts. Back in March it was, wearing a mask might make you feel a little better. Then at some point I began reading that N95 masks were only said to work, but were not recommended for the general public. Then what seemed like the very next day the CDC issued guidance of face coverings, where we were told to cut our underwear in half and sew some rubber bands on them to attach them to our faces. Meanwhile, some places such as Sweden never did turn to masks and even stated that wearing them may be dangerous. But our experts are brilliant and theirs are complete imbeciles, I guess. Of course, during this mask wearing and social distancing, the virus continued to spread, but at the same time, the cause of death due to COVID-19 was also inflated, admittedly so by the director of the CDC himself. Then, as we so-called flattened the curve, the overlords allowed us a little more freedom in some states. But of course, in July, there was a second wave across various states, most notably Florida and Texas, which again resulted in numerous mistakes in death counts and manipulation of the actual numbers due to redefinition of a COVID case, where probable cases were listed as confirmed cases, as well as the discovery of many contaminated test kits. Now, most recently in August, the CDC admitted that only 6% of COVID deaths are from COVID alone. But of course, this was immediately rephrased and defended as with every single thing that may make this virus look slightly less dangerous than they want you to believe. Thankfully, an analysis had been completed on these numbers. Taking out comorbidities and causes of death completely unrelated to COVID would conservatively leave 50,000 deaths due to COVID. 5,000 of the total deaths reported as COVID were actually due to accidental deaths and poisonings. These 50,000 deaths placed over the 5.9 million cases at the time of reporting would indicate a death rate of 0.85% or a 99.15% survival rate. This would indicate that healthy people have a small chance of being affected by COVID, and that the majority of these deaths are in those of those elderly people as well as those who have underlying conditions. Also, 50,000 over the 2.2 million predicted deaths is only 2%. But hey, let's lock down everyone, not just protect those most at risk. Now, as you can see, people have been largely opposed to the extended lockdowns en masse due to the lack of consistency from our so-called experts and the media. It's very hard to ignore the political push by the media and those people rubbing their hands together on Facebook, posting tragic stories of death, destruction from the COVID-19 virus, while themselves not even wearing masks in public gatherings and traveling all over the place. Meanwhile, people have lost businesses they spent their entire lives building. Some weren't even allowed to attend family funerals. Some died of other illnesses and didn't even get to spend their final days with family members. And many missed cancer screenings and treatments. And some are in pain due to various routine surgeries that were put on hold, all for some virus that has a 98% survival rate. Then to add more insult to injury, our experts have no end game in mind except for a vaccine. We just wear protective face coverings and extend the life of the virus and then get a vaccine and we're saved. But I can't help but bring up a study that was widely broadcasted by our media that found that people are being infected more than once, which would mean that herd immunity is unlikely. But of course, I've found contradictory statements by an infectious disease expert that said that reinfection is actually very unlikely, and a second reinfection would be much more mild than the first. This is a good thing, by the way. Hate to burst your bubbles. This would suggest that herd immunity does work to a degree. But hey, let's pretend that it doesn't work. How then would a vaccine work? Will it be a yearly thing like the flu? How long until we have the vaccine? I mean, these experts have been so good at predicting everything else with the virus. I'm sure the vaccine will be here real soon, as well as safe and effective. And if we're not comfortable with the vaccine, then what do we do? Do we just wear masks for eternity? Is this the new normal, as they say? These are the things that have made us anti-maskers reluctant to take advice from the so-called government experts. And I'm not trying to make fun of anyone, but you cannot ignore the danger of letting this corrupt and incompetent government legislate our lives. Even more perverse is that the large tech companies and search engines are removing and making it difficult to find anything that involves mistakes by the government agencies handling this virus, as well as silencing other doctors from speaking out against anything the government has done, or any potential treatments, or anything that would suggest the virus has been mishandled in any way or could be dealt with other than masks and vaccines. This is meanwhile seen as following science and protecting the world from right-winger conspiracy theorists. And I've personally shared articles that have been removed from a particular social media platform. But I'll ask you who love the overlords, how do you know that the information provided by the government and the media is actually the truth, and that the so-called fact checkers are correct? And giving all the information I have provided, how can you blame us for not trusting the government agencies and corporations that benefit from COVID deaths and the lockdowns? The government has been great at ending crime, drug abuse, handling Social Security, our taxes, wars, race relations. They've never tried to take advantage of us. And have you noticed none of these experts are talking about natural ways of preventing or getting over disease? Even though we know that vitamin C and D help us build a strong immune system and could save lives. And maybe talking about exercise would be beneficial. But let's go back to the mask mandates, the most recent requirement from the experts, that I don't know if will ever go away unless we take a vaccine. Now, everyone knows that the effectiveness of masks in a community setting to prevent viral infection has been highly contested, even by our experts in the government. There have been numerous studies that show a wide variety of results on the effectiveness of masks and surgical face mask coverings, which contain about as much bacteria as your grandma's stained underwear hanging off your nose, if you don't clean them, by the way. That's right, so even though our so-called government experts have changed their mind on masks from being ineffective to a symbol, and then saying that they admittedly lied to us in the first case, and now that they're very effective at stopping COVID, it does not mean in reality that they're effective. However, I'm conceding that I do not know if certain masks are effective or not. Based on my research, I found that most studies prior to 2020 have stated that masks are relatively ineffective to viruses. But of course, these were viruses prior to COVID. So apparently research was bad, or this virus is just very different. I will say that I do not believe they're as effective as people make them out to be, especially the ones we're using. And the most prominent reason for this is simply due to the fact that the case data doesn't seem to give a hoot about lockdowns or masks. Many places have had severely larger spikes after the lockdowns and masks than before the lockdowns and mask wearing. Now, I don't know the reason for this, but I do know that states and countries with no lockdowns and fewer restrictions fared just as well as those who have locked down and had mask mandates. For example, Florida has been crucified by the media for issuing a mask mandates and having large spikes. But when you compare Florida to California, who was exposed much earlier, their graphs or infection rates are quite similar. They both had large spikes in July. The only difference is that one had significant lockdowns and restrictions, that being California, and the other had not. Interestingly enough, both had the exact same death rate when I ran the number of deaths to their case count. And when I compared Nebraska, who does not have a widespread mask mandate or restrictions, to a similarly populated state, New Mexico, who does have a mask mandate and many restrictions, Nebraska was found to have a higher case count, but they had significantly less deaths per capita than New Mexico. Then I looked at Wisconsin. Wisconsin had ordered a mask mandate of August 1st, but of course their biggest spikes are occurring now, in late September, well after the mask mandate. And at the same time, the deaths per day have changed very little pre- and post-mask mandate, which is a very good thing, of course. Then it occurred to me to compare Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. They're in the same area. They have had similar populations and similar cultures. Iowa never ordered a lockdown or mask mandate. Wisconsin has a mask mandate and had a stay-at-home order, but it was overturned very early on. And Minnesota had been very strict the entire time. Minnesota has the highest death rate of all three. Iowa has the highest deaths per capita. Minnesota was in the middle, and Wisconsin has the least deaths per capita. Now, I have to remind you that this is based on data on the health sites, not the data that was sorted out from external causes. So even comparing this data may be slightly incorrect. Also, overall, Japan did very well, even though they never locked down like us. They did use masks, but they also seen very large spikes, so the masks don't seem to be effective. In addition, Sweden did not lock down or mandate masks and have around 6,000 deaths. They may have had higher death rates than other Scandinavian countries, but they also have lower deaths per capita than many European countries who've ordered very strict lockdowns. And in addition, they did not sacrifice their citizens' livelihood or well-being. And meanwhile, probably didn't also sacrifice any cancer screenings or treatments, and probably didn't see the spikes in suicide that we've seen here. Okay, so I think we've established that the lockdowns and mask mandates have made little to no difference in controlling the virus or reducing deaths, especially when you factor in the increase in deaths and illnesses due to other diseases and the economic impacts on families. Now to my main point. All of these restrictions and mandates were sold to the public as 14 or 15 days to flatten the curve or to slow the spread of the virus. Almost the entire population, including the so-called grandma killers, were fine with the initial lockdown after seeing the models and the news. Well, thank God we've never even come close to the original 2.2 million death prediction when the government made these orders. Those states and countries with no lockdowns should be 1,000 times worse than those that have had lockdowns to justify the government's continuous actions against the public and in the numerous supplementary deaths that will now result. But this is the problem with trusting the overlords with anything. They always abuse their power. 14 or 15 days turned into 180 plus days. Lives have been destroyed. Some form of herd immunity has been proven to work. Look at the curves. In countries and states that have experienced the virus early on, deaths are down, even during rises in cases. The virus swept through regardless of masks and lockdowns. Herd immunity will work for the rest of the country by preventing those who've had the illness from spreading it onto the most vulnerable. We can protect our elderly in other ways, designating persons to get groceries and isolating those most at risk. We should resist any attempts of forced vaccines or any other measure we're not comfortable with. We must stand up to these overlords. It's time to open up society and go back to the pre-new normal. Because as my friend Tom Woods pointed out, life isn't about just living. It's actually about enjoying one's life. That comes through camaraderie, laughing with friends, travel, and seeing somebody else's smile for Christ's sake. We understand that we must protect those who are most vulnerable. We have hearts. We love our grandmothers. But no more force. No more supplementary deaths, living lives in despair, no more keeping our children from developing in schools. We must allow individuals and businesses to make their own decisions for themselves. Force is not the way to run a society.